On today's World Insight, mix of ancient art and modern aesthetic, China's Dunhuang, famous for Buddhist cave painting, stands out as a time-worn melting pot of cultures. A resident scholar tells us why.
There's that much wealth, artistic wealth and human creativity here. It just doesn't, there's no other place like it on the planet.
And two expat pathfinders explain why culture matters in a pandemic and how China's rock evolved through decades.
At the center of this.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Today we'll bring you a special program on Chinese culture from the ancient fast forward to the modern. First of all, Dunhuang. For merchants and artists traveling along the legendary Silk Road, the city of Dunhuang in northwestern China's Gansu province is a significant crossroad. These travelers left indelible marks with traditions, temples, and Buddhist arts, making it one of China's most culturally rich travel destinations. The Mogao grottos, just outside the city, mainly built during the Tang Dynasty, are an eye-popping treasure trove of Buddhist art. It is also a great demonstration of how cultures interact and exchanged throughout different dynasties of China. To know more about this culture, I talked to Neil Schmidt, the scholar in residence at Dunhuang Academy in Gansu, who specializes on the Silk Road and Buddhist studies. He shared deep insights into the Mogao caves and the surrounding areas of Dunhuang and how the art and culture has evolved throughout history with cultural exchanges between China and the rest of the region. And I'm joined by Neil Schmidt, the scholar in residence at the Dunhuang Academy. Neil, finally, good to see you.
Likewise, great seeing you as well.
You are
Welcome
sitting
to
in a
Dunhuang.
dazzling place. Tell me more about it. Where are you?
Okay, well, so I'm sitting in front of the Mogao Caves here in a very, very small oasis about 25 kilometers outside of the larger oasis of Dunhuang. And you can see behind me, these are the Sanwei Mountains.
Wow.
And on the other side, in front of me, are the Mogao Caves.
Amazing. I know in order to talk to us, you hide away from all the tourists, but there might be buses and the security guards, little carts passing by.
Right, exactly. Sorry for the occasional intrusions, but yeah, so we have a lot of tourists here now.
Thank you so much for choosing such a wonderful spot for us. Let me jump directly into the questions, Neil.
Sure.
You know, what was your first Dunhuang moment, in a way? What about that has led you to be where you are today at the Dunhuang Academy?
Well, that moment happened more than 3 decades ago. When I was a student and I had read a book by a University of Pennsylvania professor, and he had translated some narratives that come from Mogao, from the library cave, which we can talk more about. And these are Tang Dynasty narratives. They're semi-vernacular. And they were so rich, and also his notes, you know, they were so erudite and scholarly, and there was so much information. I thought, I have to find out more about this place. You know, and that was the initial moment, you know, reading some literature that got me interested.
What kind of literature? And what did you read?
Well,
what kinds of questions were you in your mind and when you started this moment?
Well, so these are Buddhist stories about karma and rebirth. What was fascinating to me is that it was a world that was so different from mine, right? A world, and also a world in some ways seemingly in the middle of nowhere, and yet, you know, this isolated, really remote place, this frontier town of Dunhuang, produced this incredible literature. And at that point, I didn't even know about the art, right? So that was the moment when I said, okay, well, I have to go to Dunhuang. I have to visit.
And of course, Dunhuang has evolved so much, especially research about Dunhuang. There's the so-called Chinese Dunhuang studies, and also vis-a-vis the overseas or Western Dunhuang studies. How do you, as an expert, see these quote-unquote terminologies and whether they're really different?
Well, you know, they grew up differently. I could say that. You know, so what happened was in the year around the year 1900, a cave was discovered with thousands and thousands of manuscripts. And later, in 1907 and 1908, scholar explorers came from Europe and took a part of those materials away. Of course, the caves were still here. And so what happened with Dunhuang studies is that in the West, they were sort of more concerned with texts, the materials that came from the caves, while in China, they really developed around the caves themselves and the art in the caves. But those, so it had to do with access to materials, but that divide is, of course, narrowed greatly over the past century.
I know there has been international efforts intensely to focus on bringing together all the references that all countries, all experts could have online so that they could have access to it and interact with one another. Have those practices been a success so far?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so when I started studying Dunhuang a long, long time ago, I had to use either Xerox copies of manuscripts. I couldn't actually, unless I went to Paris or unless I went to London or St. Petersburg, or Leningrad then, I couldn't actually see the manuscripts except via sort of bad copies. And so, on the other hand, you know, I had to come to Dunhuang to see the caves themselves, to Mogam. And so these efforts that started in the 1990s to digitize all the materials have been revolutionary. I mean, they've completely changed the way, for example, I do research in my ability to gather together materials from every collection around the world and put them together in ways that weren't possible until the digitization began to happen.
Having said that, though, Dunhuang, as you may know, Neil, has a lot to do with how people interpreted its history, particularly the history of discovering Dunhuang. There were different versions. Some versions were suggesting, you know, the Taoist monk in Dunhuang earlier discovered the cave and then shared that information with his, shall I say, acquaintance. And then eventually the world got to know. And China, on the other hand, the research about that only happened a bit later. However, there are other versions about how Dunhuang's all the materials and the caves were discovered and how different teams jump on it. What are some of the research you've been doing about this part of history?
I've been interested in of course, the story of discovery and how this Taoist abbot, Wang Yuanlu, found this library cave with all the, you know, a remarkable number of manuscripts and paintings. And this is in the year 1900. And so that material sort of sat there, and it was interesting because he tried to get the attention of Chinese officials to help them understand the value of it. But, you know, this is the situation in China at that time was not very good. You know, the various rebellions were going on and things were a little chaotic. And so it wasn't a high priority. And it was only then when Westerners came, for example, R.L. Stein in 1907 and then in 1908, Paul Pelliot, that the materials began to be put on the map. And Paul Pelliot was very interesting because he went to Beijing and he shared all the materials that he had with Chinese scholars. So this is in 1909. And so some of the first studies actually on Dunhuang materials were by Chinese scholars in Beijing at that time.
On the other hand, there are different stories and versions about how those materials were being taken away and also away from China. And some were suggesting exploitation, some were suggesting about, you know, so how do you see that part of history and the narrative and the rhetorics, it seems, coming from different sources?
Well, obviously it's a complex period, and it has to do with certain power plays. I mean, for example, Europeans were very, very interested and also for their own sense of confidence and to make their particular country or nation look better. You know, it was getting antiquities was you know, a major way to do this. And so coming to China, as we all know, you know, this happened frequently. And I have to admit, the way that Stein obtained the materials was a bit of a subterfuge. But on the other hand, you know, and it was former director Wang Shudong, who is now the director of the Palace Museum, and also the person who hired me here. You know, and I think he has a good take on it, and he says, you know, well, in some ways it is unfortunate this material left China, but on the other hand, it's been an opportunity for China, for the rest of the world to understand China, right? I mean, when these materials went to Europe, they created an explosion of interest when they were first displayed in various exhibitions in the early 20th century. And they really expanded Chinese studies a great deal throughout the 20th century. They're a real impetus in so many ways.
The other debate, of course, about Dunhuang is how high exactly is the standard of aesthetics, of arts, of culture that's reflected in the caves, and also the materials that you said discovered in the year 1900. We understand it's a wide range of subjects that Dunhuang, embraced over the hundreds of years. So tell me more about your judgment.
Well, I think, quite honestly, I think there's no other place like it on the planet. I mean, and that's just not my bias. I mean, I think it's true in terms of the sheer volume of human creativity that we find in these caves. I mean, they span roughly a 1,000-year period. They contain all different types of iconography and style, of course, multicultural in so many ways. And there are 492 painted caves, and there are 735 caves altogether in this kilometer plus long cliff face here. And yet, if you could think of 100 Sistine chapels, right? There's that much wealth, artistic wealth, and human creativity here. It just doesn't. There's no other place like it on the planet. That's my firm conviction.
It's beyond words. I could tell while you're explaining.
It is. Absolutely. No, it's quite remarkable. Just the range of materials and also cross-cultural materials that the caves contain, and the sheer artistry. If we think here we are in a frontier town on the edge of civilization, so to speak, what was going on in the Tang Dynasty during this period, right? If we're here, 1,000, 2,000 kilometers away from Chang'an or Luoyang, imagine the quality of art that existed there.
Your specific research, tell me more about it, and what angles are you approaching, because there's so many people doing research about Dunhuang, and what has that process of researching taught you about the nature of the subject you're researching about?
Well, so I have a large project which is to do a comprehensive guide to Dunhuang studies. So materials in St. Petersburg, materials in London, in Beijing, in Tokyo, and to gather together all the primary source materials, for example, paintings or manuscripts, and then also the secondary studies. So, who has worked on this type of painting, or who has worked on that type of literature. And so as a guide, because there's so much material, it should serve as a means for people to enter into the depth of Dunhuang studies and all the materials that we have. So, for example, somebody doing economics, they would be able to say, okay, well, what were medieval economics like in Dunhuang? Where do I turn to find those sources, or literature, or art, all these fields? And I think what's remarkable about materials, especially the manuscripts, is that they're so detailed, and they're so immediate, and we have intimate details of people's lives. We have their hopes and fears, because this material was sealed up in this cave, the library cave, around the year 1000, and then forgotten about. And because people reused manuscripts, because paper was scarce at certain times, we have everything from students practicing their Chinese characters, to doodles, to monastic economic records, just literature, every manner of, script and text that would have been thrown away. And so I think it's possible to do a kind of empathetic scholarship, right? Where we really tried to look at the hopes and concerns, the desires, the fears of these people who we have so much detail on.
Now we all know, it's widely believed that Tang Dynasty is one of those very opened up dynasty of Chinese history. Tell me more about what you have discovered together with other experts about that part of Dunhuang.
Well, I think what's interesting is that it's very, very clear that Dunhuang at that time was a composite society of many, many different cultures. And of course that was true in Luoyang and Chang'an as well during the period. But here, of course, we have so much material that remains from that time. And you really see this cross-pollination. I mean, we have, even earlier, we have caves that have, of course, Chinese deities, but also Taoist deities and Buddhist deities, Hindu gods, even Greek influences. And what's remarkable is that it's all in a single space, and it's not conflictual, right? That there's this kind of porousness of cultures. But I think also, especially during the Tang Dynasty, there was such a sense of confidence in China, in the Tang, that people could accept these influences and really play with them. There's this kind of ludic element to the caves and the ability to mix and match. And then something out of that very, very creative comes that is unique in its own.
Tell me more about some of the specifics. What cave, which mural, what Buddha can give you that sense? If we got an opportunity once again to go to Dunhuang, what are some of the places we must go and visit?
I would recommend a cave like 285, which is actually earlier than the Tang, or cave 249, which have, these remarkable murals on the ceilings with, the wind god and the thunder god, and which are very Chinese gods in this case, Queen Mother of the West and King Father of the East, but also Buddhist deities, Asura, for example, of course, the Buddha himself. And all these are in a single space, and we have to remember that these caves are like portals, portals to another world, portals to salvation in some senses. And so they're very ecumenical in that sense, extremely cosmopolitan, extremely sophisticated.
And I'm sitting in the studio. I wish I could be there, sitting there together with you. Tell me more about how will this, really fresh and also vivid depiction of the mindset, of the stories, of the real life of that time, inspire you about what to do to research about culture?
I think one of the things that is truly remarkable about this site is that we have textual materials and visual materials, material culture, right? Of course, these spaces that you can actually go in and feel and experience what people felt and experienced in say, for example, the Tang Dynasty. And in these caves, they're multi-sensorial, right? We have, of course, vision, but we have images of thousands of musical instruments, right? We have fabrics that they're painted, right? But they mimic fabric, so there's something tactile there. Senses such as smell. We have images of incense burning. So you really get an idea of the richness of these people's lives in ways that is extremely rare in any other circumstance. And the caves, together with the texts themselves, are much like an ethnographic collection. So again, we can enter into the details of people's lives, daily lives, on a really, minuscule, in terms of minutia, really detailed level that we simply can't do anywhere else.
Neil, I remember visiting not only Dunhuang, but some of the near surroundings. One of those is the Yangguan Gate. We know through geography that is one of the ancient gate that China kept closed after the country closed. And it's interesting how, the ups and downs of Dunhuang, with its rich cultural exchange history background, related to how China is open and closed throughout history. Tell me more about how you see that.
Well, it's quite remarkable because I think there are some misconceptions about the Silk Road and how the Silk Road actually operated. And it was largely dependent on Chinese government support. So, for example, when in Western China, what we call Xiyu, the Western regions, when China controlled that area, it had settlers out there, it had soldiers out there. Soldiers needed to be paid, and they'd be paid in silk. And so, this was a fundamental means of money. In fact, I mean, it's much more convenient than, say, coins. It's very portable. And so, because of that Chinese government support, silk would flow westward. But when the Silk Road was shut down in some ways due to certain tribes or certain situations having to do with war or invasions, that trade stopped. So it really had to do with the ability for the Silk Road to be kept peaceful and to be maintained, and that really allowed for the trade to happen. But once that stopped, trade stopped as well.
Right, and Dunhuang not anymore become the most attractive place because Dunhuang was there because of the Silk Road, because of the interaction.
Yes, it's a frontier town, right? It was a commandery set up by Han Wudi. And so it was at that point that the region began to be stabilized. And it's from that point forward, if times were peaceful, trade was extremely active. But it had to do with the strategic location of the oasis on the Silk Road, which is actually at the sort of mouth of the Heshi corridor, which is like a funnel that goes into central China.
There's just so much there that needs to be studied. What do you think inspirations our generation can draw from, the enormous amount of research about Dunhuang? As a researcher, what have you learned as inspiration?
It's a place that is inspirational, I think, number one, just because of the sheer depth of human creativity, but also because it's not, as I mentioned before, you go into these caves, they're multicultural, in so many ways, and they're not conflictual, right? There really is this harmonious balance in so many ways of different cultures, of different art forms that come together in these unique spaces here. And I think there's something to be learned from that. There's, as I mentioned before, the Tang Dynasty was an incredibly self-confident period in Chinese history. And so that confidence, it allows people to be open, right? They're not fearful. There's a porousness, an ability to accept. And one of the things that I think we forget is that a lot of the people who traveled along the Silk Road were refugees, fleeing from places of conflict. And they would come here, which, at times is extremely peaceful for hundreds of years, and were able to share their skills and their knowledge with people here. And I think there's something really remarkable to learn from that.
As a researcher of culture, and as someone who is sitting on a treasure that's already hundreds of years old, tell me, how do you see the world history? Some say it will be progressing, but others suggest there will be always big ups and downs. Some suggest, well, it's the same logic, just different ways. Some say we're not necessarily going forward, at least for now, maybe going back. So, Neil, help me about that.
Sure. Well, no, that's a profound question. I mean, I think, that we can't assume progress will always be there, right? I think it's something that we need to, in some ways, fight for. We need to be very, very aware that things can go the wrong direction, and we need to be hypervigilant. This is something I feel very, very strongly about, and that hypervigilance also includes being able to share our culture, right? Being able to help each other understand each other's culture, and we just cannot take progress as a given.
Finally, before we go, Neil, Dunhuang Grottos, together with Dunhuang Academy, have been doing enormous amount of work for the preservation and protection of Dunhuang. But we know, it's just the way it is that cultural heritage sites, they erode and disappears. Yes. So what's the best way, from your perspective, to protect it?
Again, and that's an excellent question, because here, the Academy, the Dunhuang Academy has been, they've done Herculean efforts to save this place. And they've worked also with the Getty Conservation Institute in the United States, in Los Angeles. And it takes a lot of planning. There are conflicting forces in some ways, because, of course, tourist development is always putting pressure on heritage sites. And so to find ways to manage that and not deny people the experience, right? This is crucial. To allow people to come, but maintain the integrity of the caves. And there are threats, everything from humidity that people bring into the caves, and bacteria, to wind, Also earthquakes. We're on a major fault line here. And all it would take is one major earthquake to destroy the entire site. This is certainly possible. So the solution, or a partial solution to this, would be is what we're doing now, is digitizing the caves and making them available to people around the world. There's a site called e-dunhuang.com where you can visit 30 caves and digitally tour them, virtually tour them. And the next step is to do something called high volumetric VR, which provides an immersive experience for people. But digitization is absolutely crucial. We've been making a lot of progress on it, but there's a lot of caves to go yet.
Yeah.
But it's moving forward very, very quickly. And again, it's crucial to be able to share this site with people around the world if they can't come.
Neil Schmidt, the scholar in residence of Dunhuang Academy. What a pleasure. Neil, I hope to see you soon, whether in Beijing or in Dunhuang. You're watching World Insight. Still to come on our program about Chinese culture. What are the advantages of a Confucius culture in the struggle against COVID-19? We try to figure that out with Daniel Bell, a renowned scholar on Neo-Confucianism, after the break.
Sometimes it means respect for conscientious professionals. We can call them modern-day Junzi, or exemplary persons.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Let's continue our journey about Chinese culture. To better understand traditional Chinese life and culture, Confucianism is a must. So next, let's meet Daniel Bell, the Dean of School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University. He is the author of several books, including The China Model, Political Meritocracy and the Limits of Democracy, and China's New Confucianism, Politics and Everyday Life in a Changing Society. Recently, he's planning a new book that will explore what Chineseness is. Let's hear what he reckons to be the key difference between East and West and their impact on society from a cultural perspective. Now I'm joined by Daniel Bell. Let me ask you about your take on the latest crisis regarding COVID-19, the global pandemic. What do you make of the cultural elements of how we are dealing with it?
I think one of the features of China and Chinese culture is that there's a respect for hierarchy that is grounded in superior ability and virtue. So sometimes it means respect for conscientious professionals. We can call them modern-day Junzi, or exemplary persons. For example, Dr. Zhong Nanshan, who was famous for helping to deal with the SARS crisis in 2003. And once he sounded the alarm on this new SARS-like virus on January 20th, it's not just the government, but the people respected him and basically agreed with measures, very strong measures taken 3 days later to deal with the crisis. And there's also a respect for, we can say, a very capable government led by officials selected in a meritocratic process who will take measures in the interest of the well-being of the people. Generally speaking, cultures with a Confucian heritage, where there's a tradition of social responsibility, concern with social harmony, as well as combined with a kind of legalist heritage, Fajian in Chinese, which is basically a strong state that values efficiency. When those two are combined, it can effectively deal with emergencies, especially important and hard to do in a large, diverse country such as China.
Professor Bell, I know you're also now writing a book about Chineseness. It is not necessarily a racial issue, but rather a cultural issue. Tell me more about what do you see as Chineseness or un-Chineseness? If you have one, you must have the other, right, Professor?
Well, that's a huge and great question.
I know, it's a big one.
I'm only at the beginning stages of writing a book that was probably going to be at least a 5-year plan, maybe even a 10-year plan. But the basic idea is throughout much of Chinese history until about the mid to late 19th century, the idea of what it meant to be Chinese was a kind of cultural idea. It depends on the language. It depends on the rituals. But in the mid to late 19th century, this is one of the worst influence of the West. There was a belief that the world can be ranked according to races, and with the white race on top. And some Chinese leading intellectuals and reformers thought they thought that the way to become powerful is to affirm our identity based on race, but changing the classification with our race on top. So this idea, I think, is unfortunately a terrible influence of Western racism, and I think there's a good reason to go back to the traditional idea of what it means to be Chinese, but of course updated for the modern world.
How do you see, the kinds of ideologies that politicians or political scientists, including you possibly, always have in their speech vis-a-vis the cultural identity and philosophy that has been with us for much more than a nation state, much longer than a nation state, particularly modern nation state? How do you see these very different and yet possibly similar concepts?
The big problem is when two representatives of cultures engage with each other, and one thinks that they hold superior views or clear, more direct access to the truth, and engage with the other as a kind of somewhat inferior person who should be, through various means, whether it's force or persuasion, learn to become like me. I mean, much of the interaction of the West has been like, with China, has been like that. I mean, Jonathan Spence, the historian of Yale, wrote a great book called To Change China, where he went through the history of Western missionaries and intellectuals and businessmen who came to China eventually with the idea that China should be changed to become basically like me. And they all failed because China has its own civilization and cultural habits, among other reasons. But obviously now it's engaged with another culture is to, hold on to one's beliefs and try to defend them, but also be willing to learn from the other culture and change one's original standpoint in response to that engagement. It seems to me that's the only way forward now.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. Welcome back. This is World Insight, and let's continue our journey about Chinese culture. This time, contemporary China, underground indie music. For that, let's meet Michael Pettit, an American with two impressive hats, one could say. He's a renowned finance professor at Peking University, and he is better known, though, as an incubator of China's indie rock music. In fact, he's considered the godfather, some say, of Beijing's indie music scene. When I first met Michael more than a decade ago, he was a pessimistic, quote-unquote, economist, but certainly the most optimistic rock club owner in Beijing. Things have changed a bit since then. He says he's no longer so skeptical as an economist. His legendary rock club D22 closed, though, in the year 2012 after the rock mecca of Beijing helped launch well-known bands such as Classic Cars, Hedgehog, and Joyside, and the list goes on. This time, Michael invited me to his world hidden in a lovely corner of Beijing's hutongs. Let's listen to his stories and his recount of China's underground rock music. You are, in a way, become the incubator of Chinese rock music, particularly experimental, a little bit music. beginning from more than 12 or 14 years ago?
Started in 2005.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you realize that it eventually became what it is today?
You know, funnily enough, I knew it was going to happen. And the reason I say that is because there was a lot of pent-up frustration within the music scene. At that time, Chinese musicians really lacked self-confidence, but there were a lot of really good musicians. They just didn't know what to do with it. And so I was pretty sure that if we opened a sort of very snobbish New York-style music club, where we really put the musicians at the center of the scene, that something important would happen. Now, I didn't realize it was going to be so much. You know, when we look back at the musicians that are really popular around China, that are making a big influence, or even popular abroad, almost all of them seem to have either made D22 their home club or started in D22. And really, it's not so surprising because there was nothing else for them. You know, at the time, if you were interested in music, that's where you went. So we were very lucky in our timing.
It was not a big place.
No. At its peak, we could take maybe 350 people, but it would be really crowded. Yeah.
But people, you could tell at that time, they just wanted to listen to something different.
It was, and the main thing was that a lot of musicians or people who wanted to be musicians hung out there. And they spoke with each other, they collaborated, they competed, so there was really a sense of a scene back then. Yeah.
Probably during that process, give you a very different input about China, about them.
Well, it was really exciting because when you think about what they had gone through, their entire lives were lived during a period in which China was socially transformed, maybe more than any other country in history in that 20-year period. So they came out of a very weird situation, sort of unlike anything else that anybody else has experienced. And so I knew, given such a strange background, that inevitably they were going to make really interesting music. And so it was a lot of fun to watch them sort of figure out what their music was going to sound like.
Give me some example. For example, some of the popular ones these days as a result of popular show. For example, Hedgehog.
Yeah, when they first played in our club, they were a completely unknown band, and we gave them a Wednesday night, which is not an important night. And they put on a performance that left me and the person in charge of booking bands, just our mouths dropped open. We couldn't believe how good they were and how energetic they were on stage. And we both said within a month they're going to be famous throughout the scene. And they were. Within a month, they were one of the most important bands that came out of that scene. Carsey Cars, PK14, Joyside are probably the most famous, the ones that have had the biggest influence on all the other bands. But Snapline, Quincy, Big Shark, Ourselves Besides Me, there were many, Chui Wan, many great bands that came out of that scene.
It was the late 1990s that the Chinese rock scene really flourished, even commercialized. However, before that, it was mainly underground. And after that, it also went underground.
In the 1990s, I think there were a couple of waves of music, but they were very similar. Basically, it was the first time Chinese musicians had really dealt with rock. So most of them followed their models, their foreign models, quite closely. And at the end of the 90s, you started to see a few really strange, weird musicians develop. And they were not interested in sounding like anybody else. They wanted to do their own thing. And in the early, what was very important, I think, was that in the early 2000s, everybody on China got onto the internet. And this is really important because before that, these people had heard of composers like John Adams or Messiaen. They'd heard of bands like Velvet Underground. They'd heard of Charlie Parker, but they never heard the music. And then suddenly, once with the internet, you had 100 years of musical history just dumped on you in 2 years. And that has to be a really great way to approach all of this music without the historical baggage. It's all new and fresh to you. Within, you know, by 2010, young Chinese musicians in my club were introducing me to important New York musicians that I hadn't heard of. That's how sophisticated. They were way ahead of me within a few years, so that was very exciting.
Learning curve certainly is an exciting thing,
yes.
But at the same time, you know, there has always been debate about learning from the others while at the same time creating originality. How do you see that combination so far?
I think there's a lot of stereotypes about Chinese culture that really, really bother me, because many people would listen to what the young musicians were doing and they were saying, this isn't original, this is copying the West, and by which they meant that this doesn't sound like what my stereotypes of Chinese music should be. But the point that I would make is that whatever your idea of what Chinese music should sound like from the past, that's dead. And it's dead because from basically 1990 or 1985 until 2000, China went through such a radical transformation. And it stopped becoming a rural country, it became an urban country. So you had young kids in China going to modern high schools, taking the subway, watching buildings being destroyed and rebuilt, spending all of their time on computers or on their smartphones. These were not the Chinese of 50 years ago. This is a very modern, urban China. So everything they did, by definition, was going to be different. And I think the problem was that we all approach it and we sort of think we know what it should sound like. And if it doesn't sound like that, we say, oh, it's fake. No, that's the wrong approach. Chinese culture is whatever Chinese artists do. And so what we should do is just listen to the artists, and whatever they say Chinese culture is, that's what it is. And what they're going to say is something quite different from what we're used to, because the experiences they went through are like nothing anybody else has ever experienced.
You know, there's debate about, for example, our Chinese contemporary art, whether that really reflects the changes and twists and turns of the Chinese society.
Well, I think that can often be a generational thing. I think that for a lot of artists doing their work in the 80s and 90s, China seemed like it had nothing, and everything interesting was foreign. And so there was this real attempt to do whatever the foreigners were doing. I remember meeting a very famous critic, and he told me China can never have an interesting music scene. And I said, why not? You know, America does, why can't China? He said, oh, because America's full of interesting things. China is so boring, it can't have a music scene. And I said, it's funny because that's what Americans say about America, and they say China's where the interest. So this is, we have a saying, the grass is always greener on the, in your neighbor's lawn. I think a lot of that had to do with a lack of confidence. But what's impressed me is that the generation that came of age at the beginning of this century, they became much more confident. And again, we're missing the point, because they're all doing really interesting stuff. I was on a BBC panel maybe 4 or 5 years ago talking about why is Chinese culture so bad? Why aren't they doing anything interesting? And I got very angry at them, and I said, that's because, you know, it's because they were looking for things. So they were saying Chinese musicians either have to do, you know, Peking opera or rural village music or Mongolian music, because that's Chinese.
In their eyes.
You know, what I was trying to explain to them is if you just look at what young urban creative people are doing, they're building this entire scene, and it's not what we expected. That's why we can't see it.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside, the name of our program, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.